Hello, my sleepyheads. It's good to have you back. Tonight, we'll journey through the life of one of history's greatest conquerors, Alexander the Great. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you for being here. If these stories bring you peace or help you drift into rest, it would mean the world if you liked the video and subscribed. Your support truly helps me grow and keep making these calm journeys through time just for you. Now, let's begin. In the northern reaches of ancient Greece, where mountains kissed the heavens and dark forests whispered the old secrets of gods and heroes, a child was born who would change the world forever. The year was 356 BCE, and in the royal palace of Pellae, capital of Macedon, Queen Olympias gave birth to a son. They named him Alexander, and from his very first cry, it was as if the world itself paused to listen. Macedon was not Athens, polished and proud with its philosophers and grand theatres, nor was it Sparta, grim and disciplined, hardened by centuries of warfare. Macedon was something else entirely. It was a land of rugged warriors and horsemen, of wide plains where cavalry thundered like storms, and of kings who carried steel as comfortably as they carried crowns. To the Athenians, the Macedonian accent sounded harsh, uncultured. They wrinkled their noses at it, dismissing the north as little more than a barbarian frontier. Yet it was there, in this overlooked kingdom, that destiny chose to plant its most precious seed. Alexander's father was Philip II, a man as brilliant as he was ruthless. Philip inherited a kingdom that was fractured and weak, constantly harassed by tribes to the north and disrespected by the proud city-states to the south. But Philip was no ordinary king. He was a visionary, a dreamer with a soldier's mind and a strategist's patience. Through cunning diplomacy and revolutionary military reforms, he transformed Macedon into the most powerful force Greece had ever seen. His masterpiece was the phalanx, a wall of men bristling with pikes 16 feet long, each row locked behind the other like the scales of an unbreakable beast. It was more than an army. It was an idea, a machine of war that shifted the balance of power forever. Under Philip's leadership, the Macedonian phalanx became invincible, and the world began to take notice. But Philip was not only a soldier, he was also a dreamer. He looked beyond the endless squabbles of Greek city-states and imagined something greater, a united Greece, marching together against the vast empire of Persia. Persia, that colossal kingdom stretching from the Aegean to the mountains of India, had once sent its army to burn Athens and threaten all of Greece. For Philip, it was not enough to survive them. He wanted to conquer them. And it was this dream, this torch of ambition, that would one day pass to his son. In the palace gardens of Pellae, young Alexander spent his childhood among olive trees and marble fountains. But his games were never ordinary. Where other children played with wooden toys, Alexander staged mock battles with insects. He would lie on his stomach in the grass, watching lines of ants march like disciplined soldiers, imagining them as vast armies clashing across the earth. Even in play, his mind was already drawn to strategy, already seeing war not as chaos, but as a kind of art. His mother, Olympias, shaped him in other ways. Fierce and intelligent, she claimed descent from Achilles himself, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. From her, Alexander inherited more than stories. He inherited a sense that he carried the blood of legends. Olympias whispered to her son at night as firelight flickered on the palace walls. Achilles ran swifter than the wind, my son. Heracles lifted the world upon his shoulders, and you carry their strength in your heart. When you dream, you will hear their footsteps, and when you wake, you must walk in them. It was not just motherly affection, it was prophecy. At 13, Alexander's education passed into the hands of the greatest philosopher in Greece, Aristotle. The student of Plato, a man of insatiable knowledge, Aristotle came to Macedon not with weapons but with scrolls, instruments, and ideas that would shape the boy's mind forever. In a quiet grove at Mieza, Aristotle taught Alexander and his companions beneath the shade of rustling trees, the songs of cicadas in the background. They studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, and ethics. But more importantly, Aristotle taught them how to think to see connections where others saw fragments. He told Alexander that knowledge was not simply memorizing facts, but understanding the threads that tied everything together, the stars and the tides, the character of a king, and the destiny of nations. Alexander devoured these lessons like a thirsty man drinking water. He carried Homer's Iliad everywhere, treating it not merely as poetry, but as a manual for life. Achilles became his model, a companion in spirit. He kept a copy by his bed, annotated and worn, the same book that would accompany him years later across deserts and mountains to the very edges of the known world. As Alexander grew, Philip's wars drew him into battle. By 18, he was no longer a boy. At the Great Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Philip faced the combined might of Athens and Thebes. It was a clash for the soul of Greece. While Philip commanded the phalanx, he gave his son the most dangerous role, leading the elite companion cavalry. The battle unfolded like a deadly chess match. The Athenians fought bravely, their hoplites locked in shields, their voices shouting freedom. But when the moment of weakness came, Alexander struck. He led his horsemen in a thunderous charge that shattered the Theban sacred band, the most feared unit in all of Greece. It was the killing blow, the moment when Greek resistance crumbled. When the dust settled, Philip embraced his son in pride. "Today you have proven yourself worthy of your name," he told him. But then came the words that would echo in Alexander's memory forever. "Remember, victory in battle is only the beginning. The true test of a king is what he builds after the fighting ends." That day, Alexander stepped onto the stage of history. But destiny is never straightforward. In 336 BCE, as Philip celebrated the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra, he was struck down by an assassin's blade. In an instant, the great architect of Macedonian power was gone. The palace erupted in chaos. Rivals whispered. Enemies sharpened their blades. The great alliance Philip had built trembled on the edge of collapse. Alexander was only 20, but in that moment, something inside him awakened. He was no longer simply Philip's son, or Olympias's child, or Aristotle's pupil. He was a king, and he would not let his father's dream die. He moved with speed and precision, cutting down rivals before they could gather strength, securing the army's loyalty, and binding the Greek cities back into his orbit. Within days, the throne was his, and with it the impossible dream, the march into Asia. Under the stars, Alexander made a vow at his father's tomb. The dream would not die with Philip. He would carry it forward, and the world would remember his name. That was only the beginning. As the armies gathered, as the ships sailed across the Hellespont into Asia, as the gods of Greece and Persia looked down upon the young king, who dared to claim the world, a story began. A story not just of conquest, but of destiny, of a man whose ambition was larger than the earth itself. And it is this story, my sleepyheads, that we will follow tonight, slowly, carefully, across deserts and rivers, through battles and betrayals, until at last we arrive at the moment when Alexander the Great, a boy from Macedon, became not just a king, not just a conqueror, but a legend. The winds over the Hellespont carried the scent of salt and destiny. As Alexander's ships cut across the narrow waters that separated Europe from Asia, the young king stood at the prow, his cloak snapping in the breeze. Behind him lay Macedonia, his childhood, his father's shadow. Ahead of him stretched a world unknown, vast and glittering with promise and danger. When his sandal touched Asian soil for the first time, Alexander paused. He reached for his spear, lifted it high, and hurled it into the earth before him. The weapon landed with a heavy thud, its bronze head sinking deep into the dirt. "I claim this land," he declared, "not as a thief, but as a gift from the gods." His officers, watching, felt a shiver run through them. This was not mere symbolism, it was prophecy in action. But before pressing into the heart of Asia, Alexander made a pilgrimage. South along the coast lay the ancient ruins of Troy, where Homer's heroes had fought and bled, where Achilles had dragged Hector's lifeless body around the walls, where gods themselves were said to have descended into battle. Alexander walked among the stones, his steps echoing in silence. He touched the crumbling walls with reverence, as if greeting old companions. At the tomb of Achilles, he offered sacrifices, pouring wine into the soil and leaving garlands as tribute. Then, in the ancient custom of athletes, he ran naked around the grave, honoring the man he considered his truest ancestor. Beside him ran Hephaestion, his dearest companion, who honored Patroclus in the same way. As the two young men completed the circle, Alexander turned to his friend and said, "Achilles had Homer to sing his glory. I shall have you." Hephaestion smiled, knowing the weight of the moment. The priests at Troy presented Alexander with a relic said to have belonged to Achilles himself, a shield of bronze, battered by time yet still gleaming with ancestral power. Whether or not it was genuine mattered little. To Alexander it was a sign, a reminder that he was walking in the footsteps of heroes and perhaps surpassing them. The Persian satraps, alarmed by the Macedonian advance, gathered their forces at the river Granicus. It was there that Alexander would face his first great test. The river was swollen with spring rains, its current fierce and fast. On the far bank, the Persians arrayed themselves in glittering ranks, cavalry in the front, infantry behind, their banners snapping in the wind. The Persian nobles, armed with curved swords and clad in fine mail, waited with calm confidence. Surely no sane commander would charge across such a river into the teeth of their defense. Alexander's officers urged caution. "Wait," advised Parmenion, the seasoned general who had served Philip faithfully. "Let the Persians come to us, or at least let us find another crossing. To charge here is to gamble everything." But Alexander's eyes were fixed on the enemy. To him, the danger was not a reason to wait, it was the very reason to act. The Persians would never expect such audacity. They would never imagine he would risk his life and his army in a direct assault. That, he knew, was exactly why he must do it. "Today," he declared to his men, "we write the first page of a new chapter. Across this river stand the nobles of Persia, grown soft in luxury. They do not know what it means to fight for freedom. Show them what Macedonians can do when courage drives the spear." And with that, he spurred his black stallion, Bucephalus, into the river. The water foamed around them as horses stumbled on the rocky bed. Arrows rained down from the far bank. Persian cavalry thundered forward to meet them, blades flashing. The crossing was chaos, a tangle of hooves and spears, but Alexander's voice cut through it all, calm, commanding, unyielding. Reaching the opposite bank, he crashed into the Persian line with spear leveled. His shield, the shield of Achilles, caught the blow of Mithridates, son of the satrap, whose spear shattered against it. In the same motion, Alexander's own spear drove into Mithridates' chest, toppling him from his horse. Another noble charged Rosaces, brother of the satrap. His curved blade struck Alexander's helmet, splitting it open and drawing blood. For an instant, death itself loomed over the young king. But then, in a moment that would become legend, Clytus, the black one of Alexander's loyal companions, drove his spear through Rosaces' back. "The gods protect their chosen," Clytus said, steadying the bleeding king. Alexander, undeterred, raised his sword again, rallying his men. By midday, the Persians broke. Their proud cavalry fled, their infantry scattered, and the river itself ran red with the blood of nobles who had underestimated a boy from Macedon. The victory at Granicus opened Asia Minor. Cities fell in quick succession. Some surrendered willingly, throwing open their gates and showering the young king with garlands. Others resisted and were crushed, their walls breached, their defenders cut down. In Ephesus, the people rededicated the great temple of Artemis, proclaiming Alexander a new Achilles sent by the gods. Priests and poets hailed him as the liberator of the Greeks, who had languished under Persian control for generations. But not every city welcomed him. At Halicarnassus, Memnon of Rhodes, the most skilled general in Persian service, prepared a fierce resistance. The siege tested Alexander in new ways. No longer was it a matter of swift cavalry charges and decisive field battles. This was war of patience, of catapults and siege towers, of mines dug under walls and ambushes sprung at night. The city held out for weeks. Menon used the Persian fleet to supply the garrison, frustrating the Macedonians at every turn. But Alexander would not retreat. His engineers undermined the walls. His men pushed forward yard by yard until finally the defenders slipped away by sea, abandoning the ruins to him. The cost was high, but the lesson was clear. Even the strongest walls could not withstand his will. From Halicarnassus, Alexander pressed inland, leading his army through the rugged mountains of Lycia and Pamphylia. The terrain was harsh, the weather unforgiving. Roads twisted like serpents, cliffs towered like walls of stone, and storms swept in from the sea. Yet he pushed on, often walking beside his men, sharing their hardships. In the nights around campfires, he listened to the stories of local tribesmen, learning their myths, their customs, their fears. When he fought them, it was with respect, and when he defeated them, it was with terms that preserved their dignity. Slowly the mountains bent to him, as tribes once hostile offered their swords in service. By the time spring returned, Alexander had secured his rear and added thousands of fresh recruits to his ranks. His army was no longer simply Macedonian. It was becoming something larger, something more diverse, a force bound together not just by loyalty to a king, but by belief in a vision. As the campaigning season of 333 BCE dawned, news reached him that Darius himself was on the move. No longer would satraps and mercenaries face him. The great king of Persia had gathered a host beyond imagining: horsemen from the steppes, chariots with blades on their wheels, archers from distant lands, and even war elephants from India. Hundreds of thousands marched under his banner. The two armies would meet at Issus, a narrow strip of land between mountains and sea. It was a place where numbers counted for little, where discipline and courage could outweigh sheer size. Fate had chosen the ground, and both kings marched toward it, each carrying the weight of nations on his shoulders. The night before battle, Alexander walked among his men, sharing their fires, his presence calming their nerves. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we face not satraps, not mercenaries, but Darius himself. They have the numbers, we have the cause. Remember why you fight, not for gold, not for plunder, but for each other and for the dream that our fathers began." Dawn broke, and the armies clashed. The plain of Issus was quiet at dawn, the air heavy with anticipation. The Persians stretched across the narrow field in glittering ranks, their banners fluttering like a sea of color. Darius himself stood in his golden chariot, a symbol of wealth and power so dazzling that it seemed unreal. His army, vast and diverse, filled the space between the mountains and the sea, confident that sheer numbers would crush the smaller Macedonian force. Alexander's men looked across at the spectacle. To many it must have felt like gazing at a living wall, endless and unshakable. Some shifted uneasily, others gripped their spears tighter. But when their king rode before them on Bucephalus, helmet glinting, cloak rippling, their fear dissolved. He was calm, almost serene, as if he knew the outcome already. He arranged his forces with precision, the phalanx forming the heart of his line, the Thessalian cavalry anchoring the left under Parmenion, and the companion cavalry massed on the right, where Alexander himself would strike. His eyes narrowed, studying the Persians as a hunter studies prey, waiting for the slightest flaw to reveal itself. When the battle began, the Persian cavalry surged forward with thunderous force, striking at Parmenion's flank. The ground shook with hooves. The clash of iron on iron filled the air. Parmenion's men bent under the pressure but did not break, holding long enough for the phalanx to advance. In the center, the Macedonian wall of spears pressed relentlessly into the Persian infantry. The Persians fought bravely, arrows and javelins raining down, but they lacked the discipline to withstand the coordinated advance of the phalanx. Shields overlapped, spears thrust forward in perfect rhythm, and step by step the Persians were driven back. Then came the moment Alexander had been waiting for. He saw it, a gap forming around Darius's chariot as the king's reserves were pulled to reinforce the faltering lines. With a cry that echoed across the battlefield, Alexander lowered his spear and led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation straight into the Persian heart. The charge cut like lightning. Horses crashed into men, spears pierced through armor. Dust and blood filled the air. Alexander himself rode at the very tip of the formation, striking down noble after noble, his shield flashing like a signal from the gods. He was everywhere at once, here parrying a sword, there driving his spear into an enemy commander. Around him the companions fought like lions, knowing their king rode beside them. Darius watched as the Macedonian wedge cut closer and closer. Panic flickered across his face. For the first time, the King of Kings felt the cold hand of fear, and then, in a decision that would seal his fate, he turned his chariot and fled. The sight of their king abandoning the field shattered Persian morale. What had been an army became a mob. The glittering host dissolved into chaos, men throwing down weapons, horses bolting, banners falling. The plain of Issus became a nightmare of trampled bodies and broken cries. Alexander pressed the attack until victory was complete. Then, in the stillness that followed, he discovered what Darius had left behind. In the Persian royal tent, among silks and treasures, Alexander found the family of the great king Darius's mother, his wife, and his daughters. They had been left behind in the king's desperate flight. The queen mother, upon seeing Alexander, made a mistake. Believing Hephaestion, tall and handsome, to be the king, she bowed before him. When she realized her error, she trembled with fear. But Alexander only smiled, lifting her gently to her feet. "You are not wrong, mother," he said kindly. "He too is Alexander." That single act of grace, small though it seemed, echoed across the empire. Word spread that this conqueror was not like others, not a savage raider who humiliated the weak, but a king who showed respect even to his enemies. It was a lesson in power. Mercy could win loyalty, where fear could not. From Issus, Alexander turned south, where the coastal cities of Phoenicia waited. Some submitted at once, their gates swinging open. Others hesitated, calculating whether the Persian fleet might yet save them. But Tyre-proud ancient Tyre chose defiance. Built on an island half a mile from shore with towering walls and a powerful fleet, the city had never been taken. Its leaders laughed at Alexander's demand for surrender. "Let him try," they said. "Let the young king waste his army against walls that have stood for centuries." Alexander's response was cold and steady. If Tyre stood on an island, he would make it part of the mainland. His engineers began constructing a massive causeway, stone and timber hauled by thousands of men, stretching across the sea like a growing arm of vengeance. The Tyrians fought back with all the weapons at their disposal. They sent fire ships crashing into the half-finished causeway, burning siege towers to ashes. Archers rained arrows from the walls. Divers swam beneath the waves, cutting the ropes that held the construction steady. The work was grueling, endless, a battle not just against Tyre but against the sea itself. Men died by the hundreds. But Alexander refused to stop. Day by day, the causeway inched closer to the island. After 7 months, the walls of Tyre were breached. The assault was terrible. Macedonian soldiers stormed through the city, enraged by the long resistance. 8,000 Tyrians were cut down. 30,000 more were sold into slavery. Only the temples were spared. Monuments to gods even Alexander would not offend. The destruction of Tyre sent a clear message. No fortress, no matter how strong, could resist him. Cities across the region surrendered without a fight, their rulers rushing to align themselves with the conqueror who had humbled Persia's greatest port. From there, Alexander marched into Egypt. Unlike Tyre, Egypt did not resist. The land of the pharaohs had long grown weary of Persian rule. When Alexander arrived, he was welcomed as a liberator. Crowds cheered in Memphis. Priests proclaimed him chosen by the gods. At Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, heir to a tradition older than Greece itself. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt and was declared the son of Ammon, a god whose oracle he soon sought at the oasis of Siwa. The journey to Siwa was through desert endless sand, scorching heat, and silence broken only by the wind. To many, it was madness. But Alexander pressed on, convinced the oracle would reveal his true destiny. When he emerged from the temple, he said little of what had been spoken. To questions from his companions, he gave only a smile. But whispers spread. The oracle had declared him more than a king, more than a man. He was the son of Zeus Ammon, a god walking among mortals. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a city that would outlast him, Alexandria. He walked the coastline, pointing where harbors and streets would rise, speaking of lighthouses and libraries, of a city that would unite Greece and Egypt, east and west. His architects recorded every word, laying out lines in the sand where a future jewel of civilization would shine. Though the city was only a vision, Alexander already saw it clearly. Ships from every corner of the world anchored in its harbor. Scholars from distant lands gathering in its library. Markets overflowing with goods. Streets alive with voices in a dozen languages. Alexandria would be more than a city. It would be his legacy. But beyond Egypt, Darius was gathering his strength once more. On the plains of Gaugamela, under the October sun, the fate of empires would be decided. The Persian host was larger than anything the world had ever seen. Chariots with scythed blades, elephants towering with archers, cavalry from every corner of the empire, all spread across the flat plain, chosen deliberately for maneuvering such massive numbers. It was said there were 1 million men under Darius's command. Against them stood Alexander's smaller force hardened veterans, their discipline unbreakable, their trust in their king absolute. As they descended from the hills, they saw the endless line of the Persian campfires stretching across the horizon. Some swallowed hard, others whispered prayers. But Alexander himself smiled. "Numbers mean nothing," he said. "When the gods are with us, when discipline holds us together, when courage drives us forward, no army can stand in our way." That night, while the Persians lit fires to intimidate, Alexander walked quietly through his camp, speaking to soldiers, checking armor, offering encouragement. To them, he was not distant. He was their king, their comrade, their leader, and when dawn came, they were ready. The plain of Gaugamela stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun, a vast stage prepared by fate for the final act of Alexander's struggle with Persia. To the east, the Persian host glittered like a living sea banners, snapping in the wind, armor shining, elephants stamping, and the golden chariot of Darius glinting like a beacon at the center of it all. The ground itself had been cleared and smoothed by Persian engineers, prepared so the scythed chariots could sweep across without obstacle. It was not just a battlefield. It was a trap designed to break Alexander once and for all. To the west, the Macedonian army gathered in tight formation, smaller by far, but hard as iron. 47,000 men, weary from their long march, but unbroken in spirit. They had crossed mountains and deserts, taken cities and kingdoms, followed their king to the edges of the known world. And though the Persian host seemed endless, they stood steady because they trusted Alexander. The night before the battle, sleep did not come easily. Around campfires, soldiers sharpened weapons, whispered prayers, and wondered if this would be the dawn of victory or death. Alexander, however, seemed serene. He visited the men as he always did, speaking softly, reminding them of their victories at Granicus and Issus, of the walls they had toppled and the enemies they had overcome. Tomorrow, he told them, we end this, not just for ourselves, but for Greece, for Macedon, for all who dream of something greater than fear and tyranny. When the sun sets tomorrow, the world will be changed. At dawn, the two armies faced one another. The Persians spread wide, attempting to envelop the smaller Macedonian line. Darius sat high in his golden chariot, the symbol of centuries of power. His immortals gathered around him like a shield of flesh and steel. Alexander studied the ground, his sharp eyes scanning every movement. He saw what others did not, that the Persian army, though vast, was stretched thin. Its strength was also its weakness. If he could pull their lines farther apart, gaps would open. And gaps were death when facing the companion cavalry. The Persians struck first. The chariots rolled forward, their scythed wheels cutting the air with a terrifying whistle. Horses thundered, drivers shouted, blades spun. To many, it must have seemed like death itself racing across the plain. But Alexander's phalanx had trained for this. At the last moment, the soldiers opened lanes in their formation, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through. Javelins flew, archers picked off drivers, and the machines of terror crashed uselessly into the dust. Then the cavalry surged, wave after wave of Persian horsemen crashing into Alexander's flanks. On the left, Parmenion held steady, his Thessalians bending like a bow but refusing to break. On the right, Alexander watched, waiting, his companions restless beside him. Dust clouded the air, cries filled the plain, and for a time the battle seemed evenly matched. But then there it was, a gap. Darius had overcommitted to the flanks, pulling men from the center. The line around his chariot wavered. Alexander saw it instantly. With a shout, he spurred Bucephalus forward, the companions forming their deadly wedge behind him. The charge struck like thunder, spears leveled, hooves pounding, Alexander at the very tip of the formation. They drove straight into the heart of the Persian line, smashing through nobles and guards, cutting a path toward the great king himself. The clash around Darius's chariot was furious. Persian nobles fought with desperate courage, hurling themselves in front of their king. Blades rang, shields splintered, horses screamed. Alexander's spear broke, and he drew his sword, striking left and right, his shield flashing as arrows ricocheted off its bronze surface. For one heartbeat, Alexander and Darius locked eyes across the chaos. One man born to a throne, the other seizing it by force. In that instant, the history of the world seemed to balance between them. But Darius faltered. Fear overcame resolve. He turned his chariot and fled, abandoning his men, his empire, his honor. The sight shattered Persian resistance. What had been an army became a fleeing horde, men throwing down weapons, elephants turning in panic, banners collapsing into the dust. The plain of Gaugamela dissolved into chaos, and by nightfall, the Persian Empire was broken. Alexander stood victorious. The King of Kings had fled, and the path to the heart of Persia lay open. The treasures of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis awaited. The empire that had ruled the known world for 2 centuries had crumbled in a single day. When Alexander entered Babylon, the greatest city of Mesopotamia, its people lined the streets, cheering the young conqueror. They saw not an enemy, but a liberator, one who treated their gods with reverence and their customs with respect. At the great temple of Marduk, Alexander offered sacrifice, acknowledging the city's ancient traditions. In return, the priests crowned him as Babylon's rightful ruler. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, the administrative heart of Persia. There, in the palace of Darius, he found treasures beyond imagination, mountains of gold and silver, precious stones, silks, ivory, the wealth of 100 nations stored in one place. But even more valuable than the treasure were the archives records of the Persian Empire's governance, written with meticulous care. In them, Alexander found the keys to ruling the vast territories he had conquered. He was not only a destroyer, he was learning to be a builder. At last, he came to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, a city of awe and splendor. Its grand staircases, towering columns, and vast audience halls spoke of an empire that had once seemed eternal. For the Greeks, Persepolis was more than a city. It was a symbol of the Persian invasions that had burned Athens generations before. To them, it was the heart of the enemy, and its fall was revenge long delayed. Alexander entered Persepolis in triumph. The city's treasures were his, the palaces his to command. But in a night of wine and celebration, the line between victory and destruction blurred. The halls of Persepolis were set aflame. Fire raced across its columns, devouring the symbols of Persian power. Whether it was deliberate policy or drunken impulse, none could say. But when the flames died, the heart of Persia was a blackened ruin. Some said Alexander regretted it later, that he wept for the beauty he had destroyed. Others claimed he meant it as revenge, a final blow against the empire that had once sought to enslave Greece. Whatever the truth, Persepolis burned, and with it the last illusion of Persian invincibility. Darius, once king of kings, now fled eastward, a fugitive in his own empire. Alexander pursued him relentlessly through deserts and mountains, determined to end the war once and for all. But fate had other plans. In Bactria, Darius was betrayed by his own men. Wounded, abandoned, left dying by the roadside, he was found by Alexander's advance guard. When word reached Alexander, he was overcome with both triumph and sorrow. He had wanted to defeat Darius in battle, to end the war in honorable combat. Instead, he found only a corpse. Alexander ordered that Darius be buried with full honors, his body wrapped in royal garments, and returned to Persepolis to lie among his ancestors. It was both respect and a message. Alexander was no mere conqueror. He was the heir of Persia as well as Greece. With Darius dead, the Persian Empire was his. But Alexander was not content. His eyes turned east, beyond the mountains, to lands few Greeks had ever seen. India lay ahead, a world of rivers and jungles, of elephants and kings, of riches and mysteries. And Alexander, still young, still restless, believed the world itself was waiting for him. As his army prepared to march into this new frontier, the man who had once been Philip's son and Aristotle's pupil was now something else entirely. He was Alexander the Great, ruler of Greece, conqueror of Persia, pharaoh of Egypt, master of an empire stretching farther than any before him. Yet even that was not enough. His ambition burned hotter still, driving him toward the horizon, toward lands unknown, toward the edge of the world. The soldiers whispered among themselves, wondering where it would end. But in Alexander's heart, there was no end, only the next river, the next mountain, the next victory. The Persian Empire had fallen. But Alexander's march did not end with Darius's death. Instead, The young king pressed deeper into lands few Greeks had ever imagined, to the rugged mountains of Bactria and the wild deserts of Sogdiana, where tribes lived like eagles on cliffs and ruled valleys hidden from outsiders. These were places where even the Persian kings had struggled to keep control, and where Alexander would face challenges not of armies but of endless resistance. The journey east was grueling. The Hindu Kush rose before the Macedonians like a wall of stone, its peaks lost in the clouds. Snow blinded their path, cold so sharp it cut into bone. Men gasped for breath in the thin air, stumbling as their lungs failed to fill. Horses slipped on icy paths, plunging into ravines. And yet Alexander pushed them on, his eyes always fixed on the horizon, as if beyond those mountains lay the answer to some question only he could hear. The tribes of Bactria fought like shadows, striking from high cliffs, vanishing into narrow passes. They did not line up in ranks or meet in open battle. They bled the Macedonians with ambushes, then disappeared into the night. Alexander adapted quickly. He split his forces, climbed paths thought impassable, and turned the terrain itself against his enemies. Where they believed the mountains would protect them, he appeared suddenly, storming strongholds perched on cliffs like nests of falcons. One of the most famous of these strongholds was the Sogdian rock. Rising from the desert like a spear of stone, it was said to be impregnable. The chieftain Oxyates mocked Alexander from its walls. "Bring winged soldiers, Macedonian. Only birds can reach us here." But Alexander was not a man who accepted limits. He called for volunteers among his climbers, promising great rewards. By night, using ropes and iron spikes, 300 men scaled the sheer cliff face. Many fell to their deaths. But when dawn came, the survivors unfurled Macedonian banners from the summit, their silhouettes outlined against the sky. When the defenders saw what seemed impossible men standing above them where only birds belonged, their courage collapsed. The fortress surrendered. Among the captives was Oxyates' daughter, Roxane, a young woman of striking beauty and fierce spirit. Unlike other conquerors, Alexander did not treat her as mere spoils of war. Instead, he saw in her a chance to unite cultures, to bind East and West not only by conquest but by blood. He took Roxane as his wife. For his Macedonian officers, this was unsettling. To them, Persia had been an enemy to destroy, not a people to embrace. But Alexander was no longer simply a Macedonian king. He was becoming something larger, something that frightened even those closest to him. Yet even marriage and alliances could not tame the wild lands of Sogdiana. Resistance burned like fire in dry grass, flaring up wherever his army passed. The more Alexander pressed, the more isolated he became. His men grumbled at endless campaigns, their eyes haunted by years away from home. They had followed him farther than any soldiers had followed a commander before, and still he demanded more. In moments like these, Alexander's temper showed its edge. At a banquet in Bactria, the court historian Callisthenes, nephew of Aristotle, refused to perform the Persian act of prostration before the king, bowing as if to a god. To a free Greek, no man was divine. Alexander's fury was swift. Callisthenes was accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, and left to die. It was a chilling moment, one that showed how far the boy from Pella had traveled not only across the earth, but into realms of power where few could follow. Still, the march went on. Beyond the mountains lay India, a land of rivers, jungles, and wonders spoken of only in travelers' tales. Merchants had whispered of kings who rode elephants into war, of cities with golden walls, of philosophers who lived in the wilderness and foretold the future. For Alexander, such stories were not deterrents but invitations. He had conquered Persia. Now he would conquer the edge of the world. Crossing the Indus River in 326 BCE, the Macedonians entered a realm unlike any they had ever seen. The river itself was wider and more powerful than anything in Greece, carrying crocodiles in its depths and shimmering under a blazing sun. On its banks, local kings came forward with gifts: gold, spices, war elephants. One such ruler, Taxiles of Taxila, submitted willingly, telling Alexander, "Why fight for what we can share?" Alexander accepted, seeing in him a useful ally. But not all were so willing. Beyond Taxila ruled King Porus, tall and proud, who commanded a kingdom rich and strong. When Alexander's messengers demanded his submission, Porus replied with a single sentence: "I will meet him as a king meets a king in battle." The clash came on the banks of the Hydaspes River, swollen with monsoon rains. Lightning split the sky. The river surged with violent currents. Porus arrayed his army on the far side, and at its center stood his war elephant's creatures, towering higher than any horse, their tusks sheathed in bronze, their backs carrying towers of archers. To Alexander's men, it must have seemed as if they faced monsters from myth. For days, Alexander studied the river, searching for a crossing. Then, under cover of storm and darkness, he led a portion of his army upstream, crossing on rafts and makeshift boats. When dawn broke, Porus was stunned to find the Macedonians not where he expected, but descending upon his flank. The battle was chaos. Elephants charged into the phalanx, their tusks tossing men aside like dolls, their feet crushing soldiers underfoot. Macedonian spears jabbed upward, striking into tough hides, while archers loosed volley after volley. Horses panicked at the sight and smell of the beasts. Men screamed as trunks wrapped around them, lifting them into the air before slamming them to the ground. Alexander himself led the cavalry in fierce charges, harrying the flanks, drawing Porus's forces apart. The rain poured, the ground turned to mud, and still the slaughter went on. At last, the elephants, wounded and maddened, turned back against their own men, trampling the very soldiers they had come to protect. Porus, wounded and exhausted, fought until he could fight no more. When at last he was captured and brought before Alexander, the conqueror asked, "How would you have me treat you?" "As a king treats a king," Porus replied, bloodied but unbroken. Alexander, moved by his dignity, spared him. He not only restored Porus to his throne, but granted him more land, declaring that it was better to have a noble ally than a broken enemy. It was mercy, yes, but also strategy. With Porus as friend, the gateway to further conquest lay open. Yet it was here, on the far edges of India, that Alexander's dream met its limit. His men, worn from years of war, weary from endless marches, finally refused to go further. At the banks of the Hyphasis River they gathered, their silence louder than protest. They had followed their king to the ends of the world, but they would not follow him beyond. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, hoping their will would break. But when he emerged, he saw the truth in their faces. They had given him everything, their blood, their youth, their lives. And now they asked for home. With heavy heart, Alexander agreed. He told them, "You have given me more than any king could ask. You will go home as the greatest army the world has ever seen. History will remember that we marched farther than any men before us." The dream of conquering the world ended there, at the edge of the Hyphasis. But the story was not finished, for the march home would be as brutal and legendary as the march of conquest. On the return, Alexander nearly lost his life at the city of the Malians. Scaling the walls in a reckless assault, he leapt inside before his men could follow. Alone, surrounded, he fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemy after enemy until an arrow pierced his lung. He collapsed, blood filling his chest. His soldiers, bursting through the gates at last, thought they had lost him. The battle turned into a massacre as they fought in a frenzy to save their king. For days, Alexander lay near death, his men grieving outside his tent. But he lived. And when he finally rose, pale and wounded, he ordered himself carried before the army so they could see with their own eyes that he was alive. The sight of him bandaged, weak, but unbroken rekindled their loyalty. To them, it was proof that Alexander was touched by something greater than mortal strength. But the march home was far from merciful. Instead of retracing safe roads, Alexander led his men across the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most brutal wastelands on earth. Heat crushed them by day, cold bit them by night. Water was scarce, and men died by the thousands. Horses fell, wagons sank into the sand, and the road was littered with the bones of the dead. Once a patrol returned with a helmet full of precious water. They offered it to Alexander. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, without drinking, he poured it out upon the ground where all could see. "If my men cannot drink," he said, "then neither will I." The gesture electrified the army. Exhausted as they were, they would follow him still. By the time they reached Persia again, the men were ghosts of themselves. But Alexander was already dreaming of new conquests Arabia, perhaps even beyond. His officers, however, knew the truth. They had seen the limits of men, even if their king had not. And in Babylon, in the year 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander's march came to its end. The road home ended in Babylon, the greatest city of the world, where ziggurats rose like mountains of stone, and the air smelled of incense and spice. Alexander had marched farther than any Greek before him, crossed deserts and rivers, broken empires, and now he entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a king returning to his seat. Crowds lined the streets, cheering him as if he were more than mortal. In their eyes he was. Babylon's palaces glittered with wealth. Its walls were covered in brilliant tiles, lions and dragons painted in vivid color. Canals carried water through the city, feeding lush gardens that seemed to defy the desert beyond. To Alexander, it was a perfect capital, not Macedon, not Persia, not Egypt, but a place at the center of the world. From here, he dreamed, he could rule not just an empire, but humanity itself. But Alexander's heart was restless. Even with Persia conquered, Egypt secured, and India behind him, he could not stop imagining what lay beyond. He spoke of Arabia, of circumnavigating Africa, of sailing past the edge of the Western Ocean. Some said he even dreamed of reaching lands where the sun itself was born. His generals listened in silence. They had given him everything. They had followed him across the earth, and still he wanted more. The palace of Babylon became the stage for feasts and ceremonies unlike any the Macedonians had seen. In one hall, Persian nobles prostrated themselves according to their ancient custom. In another, Macedonian officers whispered uneasily about their king's growing obsession with Eastern traditions. At Susa, he had forced mass marriages between his generals and Persian women, trying to fuse East and West into one people. To some, it was vision. To others, betrayal. And always, there was wine. Alexander drank heavily, sometimes in celebration, sometimes in grief. The death of Hephaestion, his dearest companion, had broken something in him. Hephaestion had been more than a friend. He was his other self, the one who understood his dreams without words. When fever claimed him in Ecbatana, Alexander wept like a child. He ordered the dead man honored as a hero, monuments raised, sacrifices made, but no display of wealth or ritual could fill the hollow space Hephaestion left. From that day on, those closest to Alexander saw a change. He was still brilliant, still relentless, but also reckless, haunted, and increasingly alone. In May of 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill. At first, it seemed nothing unusual, a fever, perhaps brought on by Babylon's humid air. He continued his rituals, offered sacrifices, and spoke of plans for Arabia. But the fever worsened. Each day his strength ebbed, and the man who had survived arrows, swords, deserts, and storms now struggled to rise from his bed. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered poison perhaps slipped into his wine by a jealous general. Others said it was exhaustion, the price of years of endless campaigning. Still others believed it was the gods themselves calling home the man who had dared to claim divinity. As the illness deepened, the palace grew silent. Soldiers gathered outside, begging for word of their king. The generals watched nervously, each calculating what might come after. Inside, Alexander drifted in and out of fever dreams. Some said he spoke of rivers he had not yet crossed, of cities yet to be built, of seas that waited for his ships. In his final hours, too weak to speak, he is said to have lifted his hand in silence to his soldiers, allowing them to file past and see him one last time. The men wept, reaching out to touch him, some kissing his hand, others simply bowing their heads. To them, he was not just their king. He was their journey, their glory, their very reason for being. On June 10, 323 BCE, Alexander breathed his last. He was 32 years old. The palace erupted in grief. His generals were stunned. How could the man who had seemed invincible, who had walked through storms and deserts as if protected by the gods, simply die? Who would rule now? He had left no clear heir. His son with Roxane was unborn. His half-brother was weak. The empire, vast and brilliant, trembled without its center. In the years that followed, Alexander's world would shatter. His generals, the Diadochi, carved the empire apart, each claiming to guard his legacy. Wars broke out, kingdoms rose and fell, and the dream of a united empire dissolved into fragments. Yet even as his empire collapsed, his legend grew. The body of Alexander was said to have been placed in a golden sarcophagus, carried across deserts and seas to rest in Alexandria, the city he had founded. Crowds gathered as it passed, some throwing flowers, others weeping openly, as if a god had died. His funeral was not just a mourning, it was a declaration that a man had lived who had walked among mortals, like a force of nature. And though his empire did not last, his influence did. The Greek language spread across the East, becoming the tongue of scholars and merchants. Cities he founded flourished for centuries, centers of trade, knowledge, and art. The Library of Alexandria became a beacon of learning, preserving the wisdom of ages. Sculptors, philosophers, generals, kings, all drew inspiration from the boy from Macedon, who had reached farther than any before him. Legends soon wrapped themselves around his life. To some, he was a god, taken too soon, destined to live forever in story. To others, he was a warning that ambition could burn too brightly, consuming itself. Medieval tales recast him as a hero who traveled to the ends of the earth, who built walls against monsters, who sought the waters of immortality. In every age, Alexander was reshaped to fit the dreams and fears of those who remembered him. And so, though his empire crumbled, his name endured. Alexander the Great, a king who became a conqueror who became a legend, and a legend who became immortal in memory. When you look at the stars tonight, my sleepy heads, remember this: they shone over Alexander too. They watched as he marched through desert, as he faced elephants and empires, as he dreamed of oceans beyond the edge of the world. And just as they watched him, they watch us now, silent witnesses to the truth that even the briefest lives can cast the longest shadows. Alexander is gone, but the dream he carried, that nothing is impossible to one who dares still, whispers in the night. So rest well, dream boldly, and remember, there is nothing impossible to him who will try.